Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Really, I have great pleasure to welcome you to the 7-day webinar series. Let us, with your permission, we are starting the first session of the program. I invite Dr. K.M. Chiba for welcome address. She is the coordinator of the program.
Thank you, Dr. Pasalathal. Good evening, all of you. It's a very proud moment, very happy moment to welcome all of you to this gathering. It's like a gathering of people from all over the country, and that's a very happy thing in the times of the pandemic when we are all caught up in our own study rooms, our own books, and our own class lectures. This workshop has been possible precisely for two reasons. One is the generous financial assistance that the Kerala Council for Historical Research has given us, and two, the untiring efforts of the coordination team, my colleagues, the researchers, and the postgraduate students. As far as the concept note is concerned, it was born out of our own concerns, our daily concerns within the department, when we've deliberated on how research is happening, what would the sources be, how would we get things done on a new footing, how would we explore new themes. So in a sense, we all had to, even in our research days, we all had to start out looking for sources. So sources were a constant source of burden in a way in doing things that we wanted to do. So can we think about sources? Are the sources out there that we can pick up and use on a ready-made basis? So these thoughts led us to think about our own forerunners, people who have, created data, explored data, culled data out of, hitherto unexplored areas. So that was, in fact, the inspiration behind thinking about this theme. And also to talk about new themes that have entered into history. So in a way, we all have the products of history. They've been published, we have the books, we have the articles, but we wanted to look at the processes where the historian actually, hunts for sources, brings out sources which were never there before. So it's a kind of a self-reflexive journey in that sense, for the historian to share the journeys that he or she has gone through. So this is where I want to place the theme of the workshop in that sense. My duty here is to welcome the gathering on a very informal or formal way. I would welcome the head of the department, Dr. A. Pasalathal. He's been the source of inspiration for all of us. He's organized this whole department together. I warmly welcome you, sir, to this inaugural session of the workshop. I warmly welcome the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Dharmaraj P.K., the Vice Chancellor of our university. He's been a part of the university for quite a long time. He's a professor of Sanskrit and also a leader in many ways. He's been the leader of our teachers' organization. So he's been in the thick of struggle. He's also been in the forefront of academics for us. Warmly welcome you to this workshop and request you to make the inaugural address later. Our speaker for the day is Dr. Michael Tharakan. I have circulated the bio note of Dr. Michael Tharakan to all the participants. He's a very well-known personality and historian. And we wanted to start out with him because his work on migration was perhaps the first in Kerala. And he was one person who had actually really to plow his way into looking for sources about researching on migration. So I warmly welcome you, sir, to this workshop and also for agreeing to do the first lecture in the series. I welcome all the participants, especially happy because they're from different parts of the country, very happy to have a platform like this where all of us can meet together. I warmly welcome all of you and I really hope that you have a very enriching session by the end of this month. All the scholars of history who could not unfortunately be accommodated in this Google platform are out there with us on the YouTube live streaming channel. I welcome all of them. I welcome my dear colleagues, researchers and postgraduate students who have made this possible 24/7. They've been working around the clock for so many days to make this, to put this workshop on track. I warmly welcome all of you. I hope all of us can enrich our own knowledge of history and add to the vibrancy of the discipline by participating in this workshop. I welcome all of you. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Shiva. Our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Dharmara, a distinguished scholar and the former Vice Chancellor of Kannur University, Professor Michael Tharakan, my fellow teachers, students, research scholars. As you know, the purpose of the webinar series has been mentioned by the coordinator. Really, the particular topic is very relevant and useful to the scholars. Undoubtedly, in the present day, the political situation in various kinds of manipulations are doing, particularly in the field of history, they are very much interested to rewrite the history without any scientific evidences or new sources or new interpretations. So the discipline of history has been challenging in various corners. So at this juncture that we are planning to conduct such kind of a webinar series. So I hope that our discipline will be enriched definitely the 7 days workshop. You are also, once again, I am welcoming you all. Now I invite our Honorable Vice Chancellor for inaugural address.
Respected Chairman of the session, Dr. A. Paslitil, the head of the Department of History, and the coordinator of this 7-day international workshop, Dr. K.M. Shiva, Professor of History, respected Professor Michael Tharakan, the speaker of today's program, and my dear students, researchers, historians. It's a great privilege to be here to inaugurate the 7-day international online workshop conducted by History Department of Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, supported by Kerala Council for Historical Research. The thrust area of the workshop is sensing the past, thematic departures and archival researches. And I think the veteran scholars will discuss the theme in detail with their innovative ideas. The workshop will be highly beneficial to the researchers because it gives an opportunity to the delegates to interact with renowned historians and scholars who have distinguished contribution in conceptualizing historical processes. I think the prevailing Indian context inevitably necessitates these kinds of programs to give new light to the young generation. Recently, it is known that the central government has constituted a so-called expert committee to establish Indian Puranic tradition as history through popular films. The hidden agenda of these kinds of activities is nothing but the reconceptualization of Indian history, focusing on Hindutva. So, the historian's task is indeed very high. This kind of workshop enables the historians to invent new sources for making path-breaking studies in writing history, revising perspectives and themes for perceiving the past in a proper way. In final analysis, this will strengthen the defensive activities against fascism. With these words, I inaugurate this 7-day international workshop, and I congratulate all the dignitaries who took the pain to fulfill this venture. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Now I invite the keynote speaker, Professor Michael Tharakan, for his address.
Thank you very much, Professor Patslitil, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Shiba, and dear friends. I'm extremely grateful for this honor of being invited to interact with such a exciting group of young scholars from all over the, I presume, from all over the world. It gives me an opportunity to interact on the basic principles of conducting research, of course, on the basis of concrete experience. On the other hand, it also gives me personally a chance to go back to my own roots as a researcher. Both are quite exciting, quite welcome. Therefore, I would ask you to forgive me for being a bit autobiographical, because to go back to my roots, meaning that I have to be inevitably autobiographical. You know very well that my subject of discussion today is writing or finding a history of migration, which indicates my basic interest in people who are on the move. But normally we come across people who like to stay. I mean, most of the people do not like to move. Of course, there are exceptions of people who would like to travel and see other places and all that, but their life is basically sedentary. I mean, they would like to stay on in a place and build up their dreams and their hopes concretely in that region. And these, the exceptions of people who have been asked to or been forced to move, have been, of course, many people have talked about them, many people have took interest in them, but nevertheless, they are an exceptional group who have to move from their place of, I would call, origin. Now, this interest or this subject came as a matter of interest to me personally quite early in my life, not only during my research days, but even early. And that, as we said, that, most of the people tend to live in their own place. They don't like to move. But you should also remember that the Constitution of India, under Article 90, guarantees the right to move as a fundamental right. Sometimes we may not think about it when we are involved even in research on the subject. Now, even though this right has been assured in independent India, scholarly attention, relatively scholarly or academic attention to the subject of migration is not very old. My guess is that it is at the most, say, of 60 or 70 years. There are various reasons for this, but then I think one of the basic reasons is that the Indian population is, compared to other regions, seems to be an immobile population. That may be due to the our pre-modern period or medieval period and all that. We had an agrarian system where the people who labor on the land, who form the majority of the people, were tied to that land. You know, they were not allowed to move, both physically as well as by the rules and regulations of the caste system, and that may be one of the most important reasons why there was not much movement at that level. Now, whatever movements that you find, I mean, if you use the Census of India and other basic sources of data available in different places, we come to understand that most of the movements take place locally. That means, you know, somewhat one estimate is that 60% of migrations within India, internal migration, is from rural to rural, and that too intra-district, not inter-district, but intra-district. Now, in fact, there are people who very strongly believe that the most mobile people in India are the doodhwalas of Uttar Pradesh, who go sometimes even beyond the state borders to sell their product outside. Now, but if you look at the statistics that is available to us, then we will be convinced that the greatest movers are women. And who are the women who move? Women who are married and then they move with their husbands to an entirely different place. This, of course, normally happens locally within the district, or slightly, sometimes even outside the district. But women on the move are the most, numerically the most important. Next to that is, of course, the rural to urban movement, which is primarily by males. And of course, now women are also moving, but mostly it is male people who were going in search of a better income or better living conditions, etc. Now, both these kinds of movements are normally taken for granted because it happens everywhere by all sorts of people, and then, you know, you take it for granted. And the studies are mainly of economic and labor availability kind of perspectives, or even social studies have been there. There are also been qualitative studies, quantitative studies, as well as ethnographic studies on migration. Now, according to Ram Babu Bhagat, who has done very interesting studies on migration, I'm quoting him, migration, which shapes social structures, cultures, and history, are not normally looked at based on social theories, unquote. Now, this is a very, very interesting and also a very provocative kind of statement to scholars or researchers everywhere. Now, there are social networks that enable and constitute migration. And there is one of the important points which is still being debated is the specific role of poverty in migration. Are people moving because they're poor, they're desperately poor, and they're seeking some way out? I mean, that, of course, there are people who do not consider it as to be a major factor in migration, because right now there is an argument, finding that the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme or Act has, on the whole, increased the bargaining power of agriculture laborers, including giving them higher wages, improved economic outcomes, and has resulted in reduced distress migration. But if you look at most of the experiences that we have around us of people having moved in large numbers, there is an element of deprivation or distress attached to the whole story. What it is, we will come to. Now, most of the people are, as we mentioned earlier, are sedentary. Perhaps from the time of the so-called Neolithic revolution, which of course is now not a very fashionable term, but because with the coming of settled agriculture, settled domestication of animals, and fishing, people tend to live in one place alone. Perhaps an exception to this may be the fisher people, because for them, even now, their ability to have a catch, have something to eat, is dependent upon chance, even with the modern technologies that is being used and all that. Most of it depends upon chance, and chance need not come up in one place alone. So you'll have to travel, you'll have to move to places where fish catches are better, and therefore there is a nomadic character or a movement, the character of migratory movements among fisher people more than others who have substituted domestication of animals for hunting and farmers who have also substituted their gleaning from trees and other plants to settled agriculture. Now, even with this kind of a long history of sedentary life, you find that there are nomadic people who are considered to be the exceptions. And you know, even now in a nomadic, you must have heard stories about how gypsies were considered in Europe as a kind of a in quotation curious people. I mean, a kind of a people from outside who should not be dealt with directly and all that. Now, yet there are occasions when even the most sedentary people will have to move, just like nomads. I mean, when they have to move with whatever possessions that they can take with them and move to distant places. Now, under this is mainly happens in cases of natural disasters, wars and famines, etc., etc. There are other reasons also could have switched off such migratory movements. So even in a group migration, need not be an individual migration, the people on the move will be leaving the security provided by their own family, their own, say, community, and also working conditions to which they are used to, and of course social relations in which they are comfortable. Now, and of course they have to move into unsettled, unmapped social and physical regions where they would require very important requirement is to have correct information where they are going, what they can expect to find there. And then of course they will also require some initial support. Wherever they go, there should be some support coming from somewhere to help them. Now, observers may debate whether the place of emigration, that is the place from which people move, are losers. There are people who argue like that, because, you must be very familiar with this important theoretical concept of brain drain, of third world countries losing some of the brightest brains in those regions to developed countries through migration, or whether they are beneficiaries, because some others will argue that, like when the so-called excess, again in court, excess people move, there would be less underemployment, less unemployment, less poverty, etc., etc., and because of the remittances coming from outside and all that. Whatever be the results of these kinds of debates, it should be a traumatic experience for the people who move. In fact, perhaps one of the archetypical work which is on migration of people is, of course, the Nobel Prize winner John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Grapes of Wrath is a novel, as you know very well, which illustrates the perils and the anxieties and and also the hopes and dreams of a group of people who had to move from one part of the United States of America to another part. There were people who had to confront the vagaries of capitalist agriculture with its highly organized banking and farming, corporate farming systems. And when they came, the peasant proprietorship ceased to exist, and peasant proprietors found that they have to leave. I mean, where do they live? They live all the way to a place called California, where they are told that there are grapes being grown, and there are vineyards there. And if you go there, you will get very good, you will get jobs, plenty. So they move in the company of a pastor, kind of a priest, who is not an ordinary kind of a priest, but a person who is inspiring them and going with them. So this has become an archetypical work of migration all over. Now, in a way, this is the background in which, of course, one has to, if you are talking about.
Have we lost? Please wait on. Yes.
Okay, we'll come back.
You're back.
Sorry, sir, for some reason it got cut off. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so now, as I told you earlier, that, the problem of people on the move was something which I personally encountered quite early in my life, because, along with the stories of, enterprise, initiative, and leadership, these are the, and also courage, because the migrants have to be all this, because, when they go to a new place and find means of existence there, they have to be all this. There should be people with some leadership qualities, people with initiative and enterprise, and also courageous people, because, they'll be meeting people who could be hostile to them and all that. So these kind of stories was part of my upbringing itself, because not that I come from exactly from a migrant group, but I have got relatives who moved from the state of Tiruvidankur, or earlier it was, of course, called commonly by the name Travancore, so I will use the same name. The the state of Travancore to the British district of Malabar. You know, that happened mainly in the late 1920s as well, you know, and onwards, and it was strong till 1970s. You know, now these there are relatives of mine or relatives of relatives or people who could tell you all kinds of stories about how they moved and all that. And uh, these impressions, these images impressed upon my mind. And when I um, decided to go into a career of research, one of the topics, and probably the most important topic which I had in mind, was migration itself. You know, I after my post-graduation, when I had to apply for my PhD, you know, that of course the fashion in those days, early 1970s, a large number of working in the broad area of class and hunger. The number of people that worked on and with were historians who talked about the agrarian systems, which has generated migrations from sort of the other, like and other. So, uh, one of the core categories. And here a bit and go into a very personal matters, which I think is so okay for me to pay respects to those people who helped me become research. Of course, the first I have to talk about is, of course, Professor Varthandavarma, who's not very well uh, of history in Union College, Halway, where I also did my graduation. That way, was not much the migration of farmers would be considered a peasant movement. You know, peasant movement has got a very different connotation according to him, and I had to concede that. I had to tell him. But my argument was that most of the people who migrated were peasants or farmers, and as long as they're farmers, why can't we study them as a peasant movement? Of course, he agreed to be my supervisor. But then he told me that if you are going to study, among other things, the migration also, you will require supervision by an expert in demography and also in economics. And he was such a great mind, great person, that he himself advised me to move from his institution, and therefore I moved to the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, where of course I had to uh, come down in a sense from PhD to MPhil. There they would take only for an MPhil degree. So I joined there, and there I had to encounter not basically historians, but I had to face some of the outstanding social scientists, mainly economists and statisticians of India, who had got together to build this institution, led by, of course, the well-known Professor K.N. Raj. But when I went there, I had to defend these two things. One was that, of course, that this peasant migration of peasants is a peasant movement, which of course they could very easily demolish. And secondly, I had to convince them that I can study this. I'm only saying that, the main issue that they brought out was that there is hardly any data available. Now, what do I do? I mean, that in kind of a, and not only that, I should bring in a kind of a subject that, I came from a Mofassil college. I came from, of course, Alway Union Christian College is better than, well known as a good college and all that. But nevertheless, it is a kind of a, in fact, jokingly, people used to say that it is that is where the poor students study, because comparing it with the Madras Christian College, which was, of course, much more elite. From that kind of a background, without knowing how to write a footnote, that's the kind of background from which I came. And, with this kind of problem, then when I'm told that, there is no data available, then how do you handle it? I returned to my mother, because it is from her that I heard most of the stories of people moving into Malabar. And she was a very good, very clear, of course, I suppose all sons think so of their mothers. She was very good in telling stories, and her stories is what brought the subject to my mind. So I used that to tap memories of various people who have been, who had gone through this migratory process. But then, I can't put a footnote saying that it is from my mother. I mean, that I received all this. Now, not only that, as anybody who has worked on oral testimonies will know, that most of them will be contradicting each other. When even when two people have been in the same place at the same time, their recounting of the same situation may not be the same. And there could even be kind of disagreements on, it's my family's ancestor who came there first. So somebody else says that, no, it is my. So there is kind of a number of contradictory statements coming out of there. So then I moved into the next stage, which I presume was the only way out, moving into the letters that the migrants have been sending to their homes in the home villages in Travancore. Now, the way in which that of course is one of the major issues in migration studies right now, because where do they get the information from? Where did they get the original information from? It is now, it is fairly well agreed that it is through letters exchanged between people in Malabar who have been there for other reasons, writing back saying that there are a lot of land available here and it is quite cheap. In fact, in Travancore, at the time when land was being sold at 32 rupees per acre, in Malabar, the same was at an average. Then in Malabar, it was at an average available for 4 rupees per acre. So there is a tremendous difference between the prices of land in Malabar and Travancore, which would any day incite farmers to move. And but these letters, how did these letters come to Travancore? It used to be sent, not every letter, but most of the letters were sent to the priests in the churches, parish, they call parish priests, who are in the home villages, and they, after the Sunday mass, Sunday, every member of the community is supposed to attend the church service. After that, they will hand over these letters and also read it for most of the people who were semi-literate or literate. So there was this kind of letters. But then my search didn't result in a large number of letters, but some of the letters which I received was of great importance and great significance. Now, then of course, I also tried to gather whatever was written about this migration, and most of it got published in, souvenirs published by the local churches and schools and other organizations. In 1970s, there were very few, but now there are a large number of such publications. But I'm saying that this is these kind of data sources really was oral testimonies being written up in the form of an article or an essay. So these are the kind of things which I could make use of. But then of course I knew that there could be quite a lot of newspaper mention. Particularly, there was 2 newspapers being published from Kottayam, the town of the district from which town which is headquarters of the district from which most of the people moved, called Deepika and Malayala Manorama, and I looked through most of their archival material, mainly of the Deepika, and I could get a little more information about the movement. But then I came across a source which I never knew. In fact, I should admit that when I went in to do my research, I was not aware of such a source. And that source was introduced to me by late Professor N. Krishnaji. He passed away in 2019. He was a great mind, brilliant person, well-known statistician and political economist. He introduced me to the census of India. And, the census never they never mentioned that there was an internal migration from Travancore to Malabar. It was, it was not taken that much seriously by the census people. But then the demographic data that they collected literally opened up pictures, very clear pictures of movement of the people, or mainly farming people, from the plains of Travancore first to the hills of Travancore. So the first movement is from the plains of Travancore to the hills of Travancore, and from there subsequently to the hills of Malabar. So this picture literally I could build up with, of course, the help of Professor Krishnaji, literally from this quantitative data which helped me write up on how and where did they go, and that was a kind of a revelation to me, which even now, after so many years, when I sit back and reflect upon it, I can't help being excited. I mean, at the discovery of this quantitative data, which otherwise, with my training as a history student, normally, I'm not good at statistics or mathematics or anything like that. I would have discarded them. I would not have looked at them again. It is a great statistician himself, like Krishnaji, who introduced me to this. um, you know, familiarity with this kind of historical statistics, not only demographic but other data. Because along with that, along with the census, I also came across inquiry committee reports, and there were pre-inquiry committee reports done by the Servants of India Society, which at that time, in the 1940s, I'm talking about early 1940s, traveled in these three regions which now constitute the modern Kerala state: Travancore, Cochin, and Malabar, and reported on the famine conditions, food shortage conditions, and also migration. And these documents are perhaps the first systematically collected data on these, this very important human experience. And using this data and the whatever expertise I could gain from Professor Krishnaji became a long-standing advantage in my work, even now. Right now, I'm engaged in researching on teachings of Sri Narayana Guru, the foremost leading social reformer in Kerala, and the lowering of child mortality rate in this region. In fact, my argument is that even over and above the introduction of modern medicine, and of course that was introduced even in the 19th century, but it became widespread only by the 1930s. Over and above that, there was this kind of a campaign led by Sri Narayana Guru, who advised the mothers, especially the mothers, when they prepare food for their children, it should be prepared in water which has been heated up. So heated up water will kill off some of the contaminations and make the water, make the food better for the children, and that seems to have had a effect upon particularly the so-called lower caste. You know, the higher the caste hierarchy, the castes who are who were considered to be lower among the women of that kind of groups, and they accepted it in spite of the problem that they had to incur greater expenses because, you know, heating up means that you have to find firewood and spend time collecting it and all that. But nevertheless, women accepted it, and it became a new cultural practice of the people of Kerala. You see, this is a kind of a question which is normally you don't get data on. I mean, you don't get any kind of, you know, ready-made data. But this is a kind of work in which the use of historical statistics has been of great help to me. And I could also quote other studies in other cultures, say like in Norway and Sweden, the normal practice was to have the used plates sunk in a sink, in a kind of a basin, in ordinary water, and wait for the waste got on those plates to be removed by the water, and then, because it's a very cold weather, so they would wait for it to for a while and then get it rubbed and cleaned and used again. But then associations of women argued that you should have a 3-sink system. You should have a sink with water, you should have a sink with soap, and you should have a sink with hot water. Now, this meant a jump in the household expenditure, But nevertheless, people were convinced that there is a health argument or a kind of a hygiene argument, and they accepted it as a practice, and it became a cultural practice of that region. So these kind of studies, in which I'm even now engaged in, was helped by my introduction to the historical statistics, which I had earlier. Now, the empirical aspects of my research was okay. I mean, from these sources, I could talk about what exactly happened. But then there were analytical questions to be answered. Um, and I wouldn't dwell much on the analytical questions because, it is basically a problem of data. I mean, that was what the basic problem which I had to face. And uh, the kind of non-availability of food and food shortage mainly, and non-availability of cultivable land, epidemics, etc., happened all over the state of Travancore. But then you don't find that everybody in Travancore, every farmer in Travancore, having moved, but it's a particular group which moved out of that region. Now, why did they do that? When you look at their their agricultural practices, you find that they were not exactly the kind of farmers that you encounter normally. They were not cultivating the food crops, but they were cultivating, in other words, they were not cultivating for self-consumption. They were cultivating um, things like natural rubber, coconut, and other cash crops. None of them could be used to eat, to live. You can't eat coconut and live. You cannot eat cash crops and live. You cannot, of course, eat natural rubber at all. So these are commodities which has to be sold in a market and in return receive an income, and that income should be the income for the farming family. But on the other hand, the food crop cultivators directly cultivated food crops, which was usually eaten by the people in their own homes, and extra, if there is any, would be sold in the local market. Now, this cash crop cultivators or commercial farmers. Ultimately, these farmers became commercial farmers with the advent of um, the, uh, the plantation crops. And plantation crops is, of course, as you know, was basically introduced by the Britishers who wanted to have tea, coffee, rubber, cinchona, pepper, and other items, other agriculture items. And with that combination, the whole economy became commercialized. And therefore, your farming population's income became dependent upon the income that you get from the market. So having a knowledge of the market, having and having the ability to traverse through the intricacies of a market became very important for the farmers in this region. And these farmers were involved in the fluctuations in the prices because some of the, for instance, natural rubber at one time was considered to be the most attractive crop because it used to have a very good price. But then subsequently there was this depression period and all that when there was a decrease in the prices. And when these things happen, some of the people make gains out of it and move forward by linking up some activities with the others, but some other unfortunate people lose out. So there is a kind of a differentiation of the middle peasantry. You have the rich peasants or the big farmers, you have the middle peasantry, and deep down you have the agricultural laborers or nominal farmers. of this, the middle peasantry, who were the people who mainly moved to Malabar, came. Among them, there was this differentiation. Some of them were starting with, say, 3 acres of land, ended up with 10 acres, while the other people with 3 acres of land that ended up with no land at all. Because when you are in a desperate situation, you mortgage your land to your neighbor, and the neighbor takes it, and he becomes richer, and you become poorer. So there is a kind of a pauperization of a sort that was happening to the middle peasantry. And then that has been theorized. That has been theorized by two prominent thinkers. One was, of course, V.I. Lenin. In using the Russian statistics, he talked about the demographic. Even by pure increase in population, families could differentiate. People with, and particularly in a context like Kerala, where there is this dowry system, if you have more girls than boys, you end up in a big financial burden, because each one of them have to be given a dowry, and and if your house needs repair, or somebody falls sick, and if everything comes together, then you are, and those are the people who, of course, Lenin predicted that, when there is a differentiation like this, the middle peasantry will wither away, and most of them would end up as laborers in the land of the people who have gained and who have got big land. And that could have happened in Kerala too, because that was a time when the plantations were growing, and people from Kerala were also moving into plantations, and they required laborers. But what you find is that is the most important thing, I think, about this migration, was that these people refused to be uh, uh, attracted to this laborers' work and wages, because that would have meant a social climb down. Because you are a landowning small farmer now, and if you have no land, you would be considered a non-entity in the agrarian society. So they wanted desperately go somewhere, get new land, and also the rich farmers who were also moving into new crops, plantation crops and all that. They found that in Travancore they wouldn't be able to get much of a new land unless the Britishers were willing to sell their land. They found that land could be uh, bought in Malabar, and they were what was happening in Malabar was an entirely different story. That, of course, will require different presentation. Now, these are the people who moved, mainly the middle farmers who got otherwise were at the brink of pauperization, found that the way out was to move to Malabar. Now, these things were what I talked about, and but what were the subjects which I should have worked on, and at that time I was not able to work on. There are many, and most of the issues which I didn't work on, I did not do much work at that time, because it would have required more reliable data, and I should have also used the same methods which I used to get data on this middle peasantry which moved from Travancore to Malabar, to gather information and analytical points about the other groups as well. One group was, of course, the encounter between the migrants and the Adivasi groups in Malabar, which, well, I did mention it, I did some work, but it was not much. And now I'm working on it, and I think I may be able to do a little more work on that now. Then there was this problem of encounter with the environment, which of course was an important point, and I mentioned it. But I had only one source of data, that was the forest department's data, where the forest area which was demolished was given, and I talked about that, how migration became a hostile activity to the environment in many parts of Malabar. Then there was two groups whom I did not mention at all. Of course, one group I mentioned in passing, that's about the women. And I told you about how women are the largest group, which is part of the movement of people all over, and how they are taken for granted. And that was the case here also, because the women moved along with their husbands. And, wherever the husband goes, the women. But then within the structure of the migration, there was tremendous kind of inputs given by the women. And that I could not have neglected. And I mentioned that, but that's all. I mean, I could not do much more work, because that was also a subject within their subject, which was not well exposed. Then there was the Dalit aspects of the movement, of the migration. I suspected that there should be Dalits, because the Travancore farming was mainly done, of course, all physical work is mainly done by the Dalit laborers. Of course, these farmers, the middle peasantry, was also working hard, and they also were part of the group. But then their situation was very different, and Dalit groups were up to say around 1930s were considered to be bonded laborers or even slave laborers, or sometimes treated as slave laborers. Now they would have also moved, and I found a couple of instances where they moved on their own, not along with their masters, the so-called masters. But their movement was not mentioned by any of the sources, any of the people who talked to me, or any of the newspaper reports and others. So that also got neglected. Then there was this very, very important thing, which of course I didn't talk about Malabar as such, but then in Malabar, just before the migration, there were large number of deaths. The death rate goes up in certain talukas. They were, of course, from the socially and economically vulnerable sections, but they died of different epidemics and different diseases like diarrhea, cholera, and other things. That is not mentioned anywhere in the original writings of the migrants on their own experiences, because they would have come across this, they would have known about it, but then that was not, in quotation, their concern. Their concern was on something else. But that was brought out by a non-historian, of course, by Ticodian, the famous writer and dramatist, who his famous autobiography called Aranga Kanatha Nadan is, I suppose, the best source which talks about the kind of miseries through which the home population in Malabar received the migrants. Now, sum total of the whole thing is that a person who was just learning the ropes of research could complete his work and get a degree and all that. But that degree is, of course, not the important thing. But there were that also, reflecting on it, also brings out not only what I could do, what I could not do is also very important. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you,
Hello?
sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for this lecture, sir. There are few questions that have come up, which I would take your permission to raise.
Yeah.
Sir, the first question is from Ashraf Ali. He's written how the life in Kerala after the end of Gulf migration. How do you look at the life in Kerala after the end of Gulf migration? That's been typed in the chat box, sir. If you could comment on that.
Gulf migration is an entirely different topic from. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Gulf migration is an international migration where various other aspects do have a role. And if we have to discuss about international migration, it becomes a larger canvas. So please excuse me for not answering the question because we could discuss it in a different. Uh, different occasion. I mean, because I was mainly talking about this internal. Probably I should have mentioned it when I began. That I'm going to restrict myself to internal migration alone.
Thank you, sir. The next
Okay, sir.
question is from
Okay, sir.
the next question is from Gopika Gopinath. Was there any ideological conflict between the newly emerged petty landlords and the native Janmis, particularly in the background of tenant right issues?
Yes, certainly there was, because this was the beginning of the commercial agriculture in a wide scale in Malabar too. Because in Malabar region there was a much less development of the commercial agriculture. Um, and the rise of commercial agriculture really upset the big Genmis, and the Genmi system was very seriously challenged. Now, I have a problem. I have a problem in the sense that my charge over my phone is running, is getting over. So what shall I do?
We'll quickly go over the
Hello?
sir. We'll quickly go over the questions.
Yeah, yeah. Next question.
Yes. This is from Shivadas, who is a faculty of history. How do you view the future prospects of migration economy in the post-COVID Kerala? Is there any significance for a research in socio-economic history?
Yeah, I can only say that it is definitely something which we all have to think about. I cannot have any, I don't have any ready-made answers. I myself is at a flabbergast in understanding how the society is being engrossed by this present COVID onset of COVID-19. But I'm at a loss. I cannot answer that.
So the next question is from Akhil Tangapan. Migration to Malabar generally refers to the Syrian Christian migration. Why is there a lack of studies on migration of other communities? Is it only because of the availability of sources?
No, that is a very interesting question in the sense that there has been work on this migration, calling it a Christian migration and a Syrian Christian migration and all that. That is because the majority of the people moving to Malabar were Syrian Christians. But then Syrian Catholics, in fact, it is not even Syrian Christians, but Syrian Catholics. But then, they, when there's a kind of an organized kind of, not organized by the church, but they themselves were organized by their own leadership and all.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please do.
Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah. But the other communities also moved. In fact, there was the Nair Service Society organized a migration, and it is that region is still visible, and it is. And there was also an attempt by the Yuva community into Wayanad region. Then among the Syrian Christians themselves, Syrian Catholics themselves, there was this association called All Kerala Catholic Congress. They organized attempt, and so there were minor streams all over. Not only that, within this group there was a particular group called Knanaya Christians. In fact, their story is a very great success story. I mean, success story in the sense that they have now some of the comfortably living farmers in Malabar, and they got there. Now, children of these farmers who migrated, or their grandchildren, are away in Europe. But what I'm trying to say is that different groups also moved in, but the majority of them, grand majority of them, were the Syrian Christians.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Srijit K. When you wrote in the 80s with the CDS background, economics was still the dominant mode of writing history, accompanied by hard data. But with the sources you mentioned, like oral testimonies and letters, is a more social history possible of the migration where individual migrant lives could be brought to life? Or is it still the domain of fiction like the Grapes of Wrath?
I didn't hear most of the question.
So I'll go through it again. Can you hear me, sir?
Now I can hear you. Yes.
Yes, this is from Srijit K. When you wrote in the 80s with the CDS background, economics was still the dominant mode of writing history, accompanied by hard data.
Yeah.
But with the sources you mentioned, like oral testimonies and letters, is a more social history possible of the migration where individual migrant lives could be brought to life? Or is it still the domain of fiction like the Grapes of Wrath?
Well, the sound is very low, but anyway, I'll try to answer. The CDS was, of course, I don't know how it is now, but in my time, it was, of course, basically a economics institute, but then it was headed by somebody like K.N. Raj, who I think was more of an interdisciplinary researcher. He was more of a social scientist, and he had a sense of history which I found lacking in among some of the history professors of my time. So I was encouraged. I was the only non-economist in that whole group. I was a historian, but then I was encouraged. In fact, it is there. Working there, I could get hold of this Kollangod archives, and that all archives have been brought to the CDS library. I mean, but now I don't. I mean, I'm not talking about the present CDS. That people working now should be able to say that. But then this letters and other thing is not collected in one place. That is the problem, But there's for people who are doing PhD now, there are other people who have done PhD on this subject. They have, I presume, have a collection of souvenirs and other sources like that. One could try to get them all together in one place, and that would be a good way of building up our present archives. Yes.
So the next question is from Christy Alex Varghese. He's commented on your lecture. I'm just going into the question. What I felt missing in your lecture was the absence of the reference to the biggest migration India as a nation faced, the migration that happened during the Indian subcontinent partition. Would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, that is that's why I said that normally migrations are mainly catch the attention of the people when it happens in situation of war or civil strife or natural disasters, etc., etc. And the partition migration was a forced migration, and who forced it and all that, that can be discussed from very different perspectives. But I'm trying to say that probably it was one of the biggest forced migrations in world history. I mean, like and and people who moved in from Pakistan to India, and from India to Pakistan, and India to the then Pakistan, now part of Bangladesh. So these are migratory streams, and it has been studied by various people, particularly the resettlement of migrant populations in and around Delhi. I mean, Delhi and UP. But that I thought was major story, which would require much more time and much more time to discuss.
So the next question is from George Gutti MV. How to approach the role of church in the Malabar migration?
You see, this is a very interesting question in the sense that since it was a mainly Syrian Christians who moved in, people think that mainly the church organized this. I find that church might have helped. I mean, I'm sure that church was a helpful factor, in the sense that the church organization at the parish level, at the local level, there the church, the priest was the main person through whom communications were sent and all that. But then otherwise, the church as an organization was not behind the migration. Migration was essentially a commercial move in the sense that you were anxious that you are going to lose your land, and at that point, how do you handle it? You handle it by going to wherever that land is available, and in that movement, they trampled over other people's rights and all that. That's all understood. But then they were on the move because they knew that land will be available in Malabar. And what they did was, the big farmers also was interested in moving. So they, in their own way, carried the middle peasantry with them. See, for instance, the basic example that I can tell you is of Dr. P.J. Thomas, who was the economic advisor to the government of India and professor of economics first Indian professor of Madras University. He bought 10,000 acres of land in and around Srigandapuram, a place called Ayakot. And that land, of course, he wanted to create a colony. He didn't do that, but then what he did was that he brought people from his own village called Kuravilangan and settled them there by giving them land on preferential terms.
The next question is from Agza Abraham. How far can the fact that Malayali Christians led the major migration from Travancore to Malabar?
No, I didn't get it completely. What did you say?
How far can we go by the fact that Malayali Christians led the major migration from Travancore to Malabar?
Yeah, that is right. I mean, they are the people who mainly moved, and then what they really did was they integrated the economy of the three former divisions of Kerala into one, in the sense that the commercial economy, agrarian economy of modern Kerala was extended from Travancore all the way to Malabar mainly by the migrants, because there was impulses towards commercialization, in Malabar, and there were also plantations in Malabar. But then the coming up of so many of these people with well-versed in commercial cultivation added a new push towards commercialization. And then not only that, they also created a common market in the sense that they were the, along with the Indian National Congress in Malabar region, they were one of the main votaries for the Aike Kerala movement. You know, and subsequently when the Aike Kerala became a reality, of course the leadership had changed and it was mainly under the leftist leadership. But then the original Aike Kerala movement committee headed by K. Kelapan, after he resigned, it was Damodara Menon. And Damodara Menon talks in his own biography, autobiography, talks about the contribution and support that they received from the migrants. Because they wanted a common market, because they wanted to buy and sell whatever things that they wanted commonly. I mean, you know. So they were for, and that is the impact that this migration really had.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, the next question is from Mubarak, Muhammad Mubarak. How can we use oral traditions to construct the history of migration, given the fact that they are more prone to changes over a period of time?
Yeah, that's a kind of a methodological question which has to be answered in context, in the sense that most of the memories of the migration are carried from generation to generation through oral testimony. But then oral testimonies can also be put together and assessed in a sense that, you know, obvious discrepancies which has crept in has to be worked on. See, for instance, right now there are a couple of publications which has come out, and in one of the publications I myself has written the foreword and all that. These publications claim that it is the 100th anniversary of migration, but then, you know, I don't think that one can. That is by their own recount. They say that one person from here came to the Malabar region or some other region in 1920 or some date like that. But I don't think one can have a starting date for migration, because people might have moved with the same intentions even earlier than 1930s. You know, what you find is that the people started talking about the Malabar migration only in the late 1930s and 1940s and early 50s.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Anushri. How much is the concept of modernity related to the process of migration?
Yeah, modernity, if you see commercial agriculture, modern formation of markets, and also banks and transportation facilities, you know, as part of the, of course, modernism can mean many things to many people. But I'm saying that if you take these individual factors as part of the modernizing thrust, then the migration was a major contributor to that. In fact, you know, if you take I mean, I've done that, you know, in my earlier writings. If you take the number of mileage of roads built by the people belonging to the migrant community and the mileage of roads built by the Malabar PWD and subsequently by the Kerala PWD up to a particular period, you find that it is almost equal. I mean, in fact, in certain cases, it seems to be higher in the side on the side of the migrants, because they were once they were there, they wanted to create all the facilities that a modern society uh, buying and selling things require. And not only that, they brought with them the yearly cropping pepper. Pepper is one of the main crops that they brought, and not that they brought. Malabar had pepper for a long time, but Malabar had only pepper cropping once in 2 years. And into that area, a high-yielding variety of pepper was brought by the migrants. And Professor C. Balan, who was head of the Department of History in Kannur University, has himself told me that in his own house, when he was young, boys are asked to go to the hills and collect pepper during their holidays. And then whatever pepper that they bring is sold, is used and sold to the market. While, the migrant farmer from Travancore would have never been satisfied with that kind of cropping. He would have had pepper vines all over and seen to it that it crops every year, and he would have collected every one of them and sold it in the market.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Gopika Gopinath. How far the acquisition of forest lands by the migrants affected the traditional land use rights of the tribal communities?
It certainly played havoc with. In fact, these migrants had no idea of. I mean, see, they came from the Travancore region, where itself they had a very severe encounter with the Adivasi groups. And for them, Adivasis were considered to be irritants. They were, see, it's like even now, you look at, I can tell you various examples, but it will take more time. Sedentary population all over the world looks on nomadic population with a suspicion. Basically, but that is what one has to to work on. And these people who have moved all the way from Travancore to Malabar, they were basically sedentary people, and they were in search of a sedentary way of life where they can make more money, more comfortable life, and all that. And anybody who encroach upon them, see, who were the people whom they had to fight? One was, of course, the Adivasi groups, because they had their own very deep sense of ownership. Some groups have already been proletarianized. Now, Paniya group were badly proletarianized by the British plantation labor and migration to Coorg and all that. There were other people who had very solid concepts of their own rights over land, and they were considered to be interfering with the land rights of the migrants. And the migrants had a hostile attitude towards them. Then they had a hostile attitude also with the kind of animals around, because animals interfere. Wild boar and elephants and all that demolished their crops, and they invented their own arsenary to control these animals. And then they had a major problem with the timber traders of Malabar. And there was also a kind of a community-based distinction between timber traders in Malabar were mainly Muslims, and the migrant farmers were mainly Christians from Travancore. These two groups clashed with each other.
Hello?
Because the Jenmis, they gave the same land to bring down the timber for the timber traders, and also the same land for farming to the Travancore migrants. But you know that when you have the same right over the same land, it wouldn't go peacefully, and there was a whole lot of friction, a lot of battles. In fact, one document I've seen describes it as a battle of Chembanoda. They call it a battle of Chembanoda between the traders. So several groups in Malabar, men as well as animals. Animals meaning environment has been demolished, along with that animals, and also people. People meaning Adivasis, timber traders. They were considered to be hostile, and then it was early stories were not very peaceful stories.
Thank you, sir. Next question is, were the newly migrant people from Travancore to Malabar persuaded to embrace new religious practices?
Were they?
Persuaded to embrace new religious practices. The migrants from...
New religious practices.
Yes, sir.
You see, because, the Christians from Travancore, they followed, as I told earlier, the Syrian Christian kind of, they were Syrian Christians. But then in Malabar, there was no Syrian Christians. Malabar, there was only the Mangalore diocese of the Latin Catholic Church, which is of course a Catholic group, but then they belong to a separate church practice. Then subsequently they had this Calicut diocese. Both are Latin. So they were the people who were taking care of the church requirements and worship requirements of the migrants. So among them, there was some very heroic, very brilliant, humanistic people with humanistic ideas and humane ideas and all that. And I can that will take a whole lot of recounting. So interaction with them must have opened up a new, because Latin Catholics in Travancore also there are Latin Catholics, but they're considered to be separate. I mean, they have their own churches, their own bishops and all that. But in Malabar, they had to work together for a while. But then ultimately in 1953, what the Syrian Christians do is that they appoint a bishop, and that bishop comes to Talasheri and creates a diocese for them. And after that, I think it was mainly the same Syrian Christian formations that get upper hand in Malabar too. But of course, right now there may be new people thinking in new ways and all that. That's a different story altogether.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Haridas BB. Sir, at present, many of the younger generations of migrants in Malabar are returning to their ancestral lands. Can you comment on it?
Well, that I wouldn't. In fact, I would be very interested in finding out about that, because what you find is that when I traveled last in Malabar, that was 4 years ago. What I realized was that people who had moved into the interior, to the hills of Kannur, Kasaragod, as well as Wayanad. They have, of course, their children, as I said, are mostly employed abroad or in other parts of India. So and the parents are aging. So now what is happening is they want to move from they've got very built up houses, very big houses. Most of the houses have got more than one car and all that. But they would like to move to the towns. And every 20 kilometers in Malabar, you must be knowing, as for who knows about Malabar, would be, this is not a news to them. Every 20 kilometers, you've got a town on the coastal region. So these people are moving into the town. In fact, it is a return migration to the town, because their children, when they're back from their working area, now there are two airports, one in Kannur and one in Calicut and one in Mangalore. So they can easily come to the house and visit their parents. And also parents can be taken care of, the hospitals are available. So there seems to be a return migration. Some people were also saying that no, some of them are moving back to their earlier land. And but that is linked with new ways of life and new ways of particularly related to new habitat formations. That I have not looked at. I would be very much interested in getting information on that.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Lakshmi Kurup. By the implementation of the agriculture bill, is there any chance in the decrease of labor migrants to Kerala?
Yeah, there is labor migration from Kerala is, you mean to say international
Kerala.
migration?
No, labor migrants to Kerala with the
To
implementation
Kerala.
of the agriculture bill. Yeah.
That unless this COVID upsets everything, unless the economy, before the COVID, everything is pre-COVID and post-COVID. Pre-COVID, Kerala economy was exactly like it was running all along, because in the earlier period they used bonded labor, slave labor, etc., to get your important physical labor requirements met. Subsequently, they used wage labor for that. Now, wage labor became scarce when different other kind of opportunities came up. And along with that, of course, this Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme and NATO, Ailkutams and other organizations came up. Now they are dependent heavily upon migrants from outside. They got people from all over the place, Orissa, Bengal, probably Assam, to work even in agriculture. Not only in urban occupation, but even in rural occupation, they are being engaged. That was the case until this COVID set in.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Shapna Krishnan. How has migration impacted women folk, especially from among the laborers and peasants?
What flow?
Women folk, sir, from among the
women folk.
group.
Women folk. As I told you earlier, that's a topic which I have not done much of a work, but I could sense one factor, that women were, they were willing to migrate because they had to migrate with their husbands, but women had to toe the line very strict. The line has been drawn very strictly. Within that only, women's migration, that is the original farmers' migration, within which women had to toe the line, and they played a role like they were playing in Travancore. They helped in all the agricultural work and processing work, as well as looking after the children and all that. But then the next generation, when the next generation came up, they, by the time the migrants themselves had started schools, and in Malabar, it was the biggest event was the beginning of the Devagiri St. Joseph's College in Calicut. That was the first college that the migrants started. And then they started different colleges. So girls were also sent for education. And girls, once they got educated, they went in for other occupations, mainly starting with nursing. Nursing was one of the major occupations, but other occupations also there were. So there is a difference in the next generation. The next generation, I don't know whether they could be called a migrant community, because I mean they are of course a migrant community because their parents were migrants and all that. But then, you know, their impulses were not that of a migrant. The impulses for the earlier migrants were, of course, migrants' impulses, and that has not improved the situation of the women in terms of their participation in decision making or anything like that. That's the feeling I have.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Shafiq KP. What about the history of migration from Malabar to the south?
Yeah, that one hasn't yet, studied properly. There was, of course, migration due to, because Malabar had the higher educational standards in Malabar was much better in the sense that they had easy access to Madras and other regions, and they who are highly educated could gain good positions in the government as well as the organized coastal companies run by mainly by the British, Aspinwall, Pierce Leslie, Daras Mill, and all that. So there was a movement of that type. But the numbers involved may not have been very, very high. But after independence, the things changed. By the time 1957, 56, Kerala state is formed, and there is a movement. Of course, up to 1973, Levinovsky has done a very interesting study of continuing migration from Malabar to Madras, in which, of course, she has said that, for a while, Malabar was still under the influence of the Madras presidency. But by 1970-72 time, that kind of hold is much less, and there could be people moving from one group to the other. But then told you earlier, when I began the lecture, most of the movements, most of the people on the move are local people who move locally. They move from intra-district. Within the district itself they move for various reasons, particularly due to marriage. Marriage is still very, very important. But otherwise, it is for mainly getting better jobs, better living conditions. So that kind of migration, whether it can be coupled with the kind of migration which happened in the 1930s and 1940s, when large number of groups of farmers moved to Malabar, is a question that has to be handled first. But more studies are required in that region, that area.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Sushil Kumar. What about the history of migration from North India?
Yeah, that of course is what I told you earlier. The Kerala economy is a labor shortage economy. Labor shortage in the sense that with the kind of education that people got all over, there are more graduates per, in fact, as early as 1967, the UNESCO's estimate Tiruvalla region in Travancore had more graduates per square mile at the time. They were counting it in square mile than anywhere else in the world. I mean, can you imagine that? That's the kind of educational spurt that Travancore had. Not that higher educated people were well educated in brackets, but they were having certificates and diplomas and degrees and all that, and they were getting jobs in different places. So once that opportunity opened up, the earlier caste structure, which prevented certain people to move up in the social ladder, also started crumbling in that respect. They could also get jobs, and with the government's policy of reservation and other factors, they could also move in, and people who are coconut tree climbers or toddy tappers or agriculture laborers would like to have their children doing the same traditional kind of work. So there was a movement from that kind of families into other kinds of jobs. So there was a problem with semi-skilled work and rural semi-skilled work as well as agriculture labor. Now, not only that, with the onset of the land reforms, the bargaining power of the agriculture laborers rose up, and they demanded higher wage rates because they, at least some of them, had something to bank upon, and their wage rate went up. So one has to deal with that also if you have got land of your own. So this is the kind of a situation in which the Kerala economy went in search of new source of labor. This has happened also when the plantations developed. Plantations developed, they first tried to get the scheduled caste, so-called scheduled caste, into plantation labor from the plains of Travancore, but very few people went there. Of course, some of them went there, and some of them made a fortune out of it. Fortune in the sense that they could liberate themselves from the shackles of the traditional economy. But I'm saying that there were not enough to run the plantations. The kind of large number of plantations which had come up. Therefore, what they did was that they started the Kankani system, or an agent system, and the United Planters Association of South India, UPASI, had their own labor bureau, and that labor bureau went in search of laborers from Ramnad district and Salem districts of Tamil Nadu. They had already come into Periyar Valley to build the hydroelectric project. So number of people from that region had come in. Then there was another stream of labor migration coming from Kanyakumari, particularly a region called Ritapuram, from where carpenters, skilled workers, they came mainly to work in some big churches where they were rebuilding the church building. So they required skilled carpenters and all that. So those who came, they practically stayed on because other people from their neighboring houses also moved in, and there became a considerable movement of people from Kanyakumari. The same pattern was used but of course in modern times it underwent some modern specifications. Went in for North Indian migration. North Indian migration, I'm using that word for convenience sake, from Orissa, from Bengal and Jharkhand and Assam. And they found it attractive because they could not only get a better wage, they could also get, according to the people whom I have interviewed, particularly from Tamil Nadu, they were saying that there is a liberated society in Kerala. I mean, because even in their own families there were a lot of restrictions, and they could liberate themselves from that by moving out. So there are a number of people who are coming in, but all that got upset by this COVID, onset of COVID. What would happen next? One cannot say anything right now.
Thank you, sir. I think this will be the last question of the session. It is from Matthew Joseph. Can the histories of migration by the church be further commented upon? The construction of memorials, pilgrimages, etc. How does church function as an active presence in migrant life?
You see, the church, I'm talking about Christian church in general. The Christian church itself has got a visualization of people who are migratory, in the sense that they are on a pilgrimage. They are on a pilgrimage, and Yahweh or God is with us to protect us. That's a kind of imagery that is. So not only that, the Christian belief permits you to move, because you may be a highly sedentary community in your own region, but nevertheless, at the drop of a hat, you can move, because you don't have to carry anything with you except the picture of Jesus or Holy Mother Mary, or one or two pictures you can carry with you, and not only that, that your belief system, your training, everything comes with you, and it is being carried on by a group of priests who are in a way trained all over the world. All over the world, the priests get more or less the same training, though there are differences between Syrian Christians and Kanaya Christians and Latin Christians and all that, but then and also Protestant Christians and all that. But I'm saying that more or less the priests as a group is available everywhere. Everywhere there are them. So you can move from. This is one of the main thing which I found out in the encounter between the migrants from Travancore and Adivasi groups in Malabar. Adivasi groups in Malabar had a sense of belonging, because their own forefathers sleep in that land, and that land is very, very precious, very, very divine. For them, that land cannot be parted with. While for the Syrian Christians, it was land to be, where you can cultivate, you can create new crops, and sell it in the market and make money. And you also pray, they also pray, but your prayer, the Christian's prayer is to this couple of pictures that they brought, and it can be carried anywhere. So your God is with you. That is the kind of concept that. So I think that is why the Christian presence is very, very high. But then my argument was that Christian church as a organizing element was not very active in the initial periods of the migration.
Thank you, Professor, for your informative talk and also patiently answering all the queries. Now I invite Mr. Abu for thanks. A lot of thanks.
Yeah, okay, sir. Yeah, we have more than 200 participants in our first session of webinar. Sorry for the network issues. On behalf of Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, I extend my gratitude to Professor Michael Tharakan. He delivered a wonderful lecture. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time and thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. We are also thankful to all the participants from various parts of the country and various departments. Thank you. Thank you all for your time. And please ensure don't miss the next day lecture. We will update you in WhatsApp. Thank you.